what it sounded like on Monday, June 3rd in Metula, Israel's northernmost community on the border with Lebanon, after a barrage of Hezbollah rockets landed in the community and sparked fires and damaged homes and also an IDF installation. You can hear the flames burning, but there were no casualties on the Israeli side since Metula is practically empty. After October 7th, Israel ordered the residents of Metula and Kiryat Shmona and the other border communities in the north to evacuate to safety. And the only people remaining behind are the soldiers and a few elected officials, who say 35% of the buildings in Metula have been damaged. Now, I got the video from Metula Novodomsky of Metula. She's an Israeli, married to a Canadian hockey coach, Mike Majeka, who's originally from Toronto, and works at the Hockey Academy of Israel program, which used to be based out of the Metula ice rink, which is heavily supported by Canadians. You might remember the story that our producer, Zach Kaufman, did earlier this year when they sent a group of teenage hockey players from the north to Canada for 2 weeks to get a break and to get in some ice time. They needed ice time because for the past 8 months, the Metula ice hockey rink has been closed, and Metula Novodomsky and her family are among the 60,000 residents of northern Israeli border towns who have had to evacuate, instead of being under constant danger in their homes, which are within shouting distance of the Hezbollah fighters' positions.
God forbid there's a war, and you're not sure if it's God forbid or not because something has to give here, geopolitically, geostrategically. But if there is a war on the north with Hezbollah, the whole country will be affected.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, June 17th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
Is life really miserable for the Jews, or are we just glued to a 24-hour news cycle?
Should we be worried that so many young rabbis are coming out of seminary as anti-Zionists?
And what does Judaism say about polyamory?
If you want answers to these questions, well, we don't have any. But we do love asking them. Each week, tune into Bonjour Chai to hear debates and hot takes by me, Avi Feingold,
And me, Phoebe Maltz-Bovy,
as we sit down with pundits, rabbis, and scholars to talk about the most pressing issues facing Jews in Canada and around the world.
Listen and subscribe to Bonjour Chai at thecjn.ca/bonjour or wherever you get your podcasts.
Most of the reporting we've done since October 7th has been focused on the south of Israel. But since then, Hezbollah troops have been firing thousands of rockets into the northern part of the country, and the plight of residents there on the border with Lebanon has been largely taking a back seat, even though many of the targets are familiar names. Metula, with its Canadian Hockey Centre, and Kiryat Shmona, where the Israel Tennis Centre is, where Tel Chai University is taking shape, where students and teachers from Winnipeg's Grey Academy High School regularly go on exchange programs and vice versa. And since October 7th, Canadians have donated nearly $140 million to Israel through the Jewish Federation's emergency campaigns. Now, some has been distributed already, including to help the evacuees from the north. But to date, only $55 million, that's 40% of the funds, have actually been allocated. Some is still in Canada. To find out why and to hear more about the situation facing northern Israel, I'm joined by Metula Novodomsky. She also works as a liaison between Canada's smaller Jewish communities and the 5 border villages and towns. We'll also be joined by Ottawa philanthropist Barbara Cook, who chairs the Canadian fundraising arm for the northern Israeli communities, and Sarah Mali from Jerusalem. She's the director of Canada's Jewish Federation's office in Israel.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Just a few days have passed since those incredible videos and scenes of the fires from the Hezbollah rockets. So Metula, you're the closest physically, geographically. Where were you the night that the fires started, when the rockets, and how did you experience, what did you live through?
Well, it's important to say that it started a long time ago. I'm evacuated since we left our home from Metula on October 7th, actually. So I watched the fires from far away. We're 8 months that we are not in the area. And the missiles and anti-tank missiles, explosive drones are on a daily basis on the north. This time it was that bad because the weather is changed and now it's too hot and dry. And that's what caused the fire. So it was heartbreaking to watch them from far away. and know that our friends at home from the civilian emergency team, they're the one who putting out the fires, because the emergency team not go there because it's too risky. So the civilian emergency team, they put out the fires themselves.
And where exactly are you staying now?
I'm staying at the Golan Heights. That's where we are living for the last 8 months, me and my family. I have 2 kids. My son is 9 years old. My daughter is 4 years old. And they're away from their home.
And you're originally lived in Metula.
I used to see Hezbollah out of my window. That was our reality. They're there all the time. We saw them. But on October 7th, something changed in our community when we watched what could have happened in our communities. And that was the scenario that was planned and we were prepared for to happen in the north. So the minute we saw it happen in the south, we just left. We didn't even wait for the official evacuation. People just left. And the official evacuation by the government was only a week after. But most people on October 7th were already gone and looking for somewhere else.
Who's helping with your financial situation? I mean, you were employed, but is the government giving evacuees pension, stipend, and is it enough?
Yes, we get support from the government. The communities who were officially evacuated by the government are getting support, either at a hotel or like that we do. We rent an apartment and we get support by the government. There are other communities that still live close to the border, but the evacuation was up to 5 kilometers. There are communities that are 5.8 or 6, 7 kilometers from the border. And they're still there, but their reality has changed. The main city of Kiryat Shmona is also evacuated, so the main services that they get, there is no one there anymore. Health services, shopping center, everything is closed. Their education system is not operating normally. They're going a few hours a day, and also that close to the shelters. Or like what happened today, that they have sirens again, on a daily basis, right when they finish school, on their way to the bus, and there is a sign and all the kids ran back to the shelter. That's their reality.
Thank you. Barbara, you were going to jump in.
I was just going to add that most of the residents of Metula are not necessarily in private apartments. There's a lot of them at hotels in Tiberias and elsewhere. And one interesting thing when Metula mentions Kiryat Shmona, the people from Kiryat Shmona are in more than 225 different locations, from Tiberias all the way down to Eilat. The government, after the Second Lebanon War, said, the Israeli army said, we will never evacuate you from Kiryat Shmona. After everything they've been through in the war, you will not have to go through this. Therefore, Kiryat Shmona did not have an official evacuation plan, which is why they are scattered all over the place. Now, there's the mayor and the city leadership have done an amazing job of keeping in touch, of starting schools, of providing services. But that just gives you an idea of, this is 8 months now that they have been scattered everywhere. Some of the smaller communities are lucky enough to be able to stay together, mostly together, which adds that sense of community. But the disruption is just huge. And one of the really big issues that is going on in all of these communities is, if the situation is not resolved and the children are not able to go back to school in the fall, at the beginning of the fall semester, they're likely not to return until the next year, until the next school year. And many of them are talking about not returning at all. The Prime Minister made a statement about, well, what does it matter if they're there right at the beginning of the year? The point is, if this is not resolved in time for the academic year, the families are not going to disrupt their children again by moving them in the middle of the school year where they're already at a disadvantage.
And this is what we call, Ellen, the silent tragedy of the North. Because I just want to put some figures around that. That's 60,000 people without families, without homes. The divorce rates have risen dramatically. People are living in hotel rooms with 2 kids. The stresses, the duress on top of the trauma is super intense. Children who are now taking matriculation exams are doing that without their peers, without their teachers, without their homes, without a study area. That's just one example of a demographic. There's been a rise by 21% in deaths of the elderly of Kiryat Shmona. When you take people out of their homes, there isn't just emotional and mental fallout, there's physical fallout, the rise in domestic violence. So that's what's happening in the north at large. And that's why we at Jewish Federations of Canada, UIA, coast-to-coast communities are involved.
Okay, let's unpack a little bit. There's a long-standing relationship with smaller communities outside of the Toronto area, from coast to coast, lots of financial support, lots of twinning. How are those projects impacted? Are some of the buildings destroyed? Are some of the programs on halt? Or how are you pivoting? Who wants to start?
I think I'll start on that one. The Coast to Coast Partnership consists of 6 Canadian Jewish communities from coast to coast: Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Calgary, Ottawa, and Atlantic Canada, with 5 communities in the Upper Galilee: Kiryat Shmona, Metula, Yesod HaMala, Mevot HaHermon, and Galil Elyon. And this is 11 partners. It is the most complicated partnership in all of the Jewish agency, and in our case, federation partnerships, but it is considered one of the most successful. So we have worked together on projects, on school twinnings, on helping establish infrastructure in these different communities.
The second piece of that is through the emergency campaign. As you probably know, the Canadian Jewish community has raised per capita the most of any community throughout the whole world, close to 140 million Canadian dollars, of which 14 million Canadian was raised by small to mid communities. So there is a new imperative built on the history that Barbara was talking about and the long-standing relationships and the know-how to say, okay, so given that we now have this serious amount of money from these communities, how do we invest in smart and strategic ways so that we can begin to help, we can help them now and help them for the future? Just by way of continuing the story that Barbara told at the beginning, that 60,000 that was in hotels initially has now totally disintegrated the last few months. It was easy to manage a community in a hotel, relatively, even though they were very dispersed, like Barbara said, across the country. But now, because of the intensity of living in hotels, out of the 60,000, only 14,000 remain in hotels. Now you can imagine the total disintegration of communities and community structures as these families become embedded in different communities and different pockets of Israel, which will make it much more harder to then reaggregate these communities into a thriving northern Israel, which obviously is important for security, but is also important for the social and geographic thriving of the peripheries of Israel more substantively.
Metula, do you want to go back? What would it take for you to feel that that's where you and your children and your family would like to be? Or is that finished for you?
No, that's the hardest question. First, what needs to happen for us to come back is that we'll feel secure, be really peaceful and quiet, not just a feeling. It needs to be secure. That's first of all. And that's the most important thing, you know. I was never afraid in my life in Metula, but that changed. The feeling of secure, that's what will bring us back home.
And I feel it in Metula's voice, and we hear it a lot, that fragility. I think what the Jewish world has been able to fathom is the level of violation that happened in the south. But what's untold is the sense of violation that's happening in the north since October 7th, and how vulnerable that leaves the population, and what level of involvement is going to be needed philanthropically and from the Israeli government to ensure not only physical security, but the emotional, the ability for Metula as a mum to say, I'm going to take my family and go back.
I can't tell you the number of conversations we've had over the last few months, because we continue our partnership meetings over Zooms. But when we talk to the Israelis on the call, the message that is overriding message is that we have been abandoned. by the government. The fact that these small community security groups are fighting these major fires by themselves. Some of the kibbutzim are trying to arm themselves as much as they can because they do not believe the government will be there, the IDF will be there when they're needed. So there's that sense of abandonment. One other piece of history that we've got to remember too is, I can't remember how many years ago, a few years ago, the IDF discovered, or they knew about it for years, but Hezbollah had been digging tunnels under the border, and the IDF waited until they came up right into Metula, and that's when it was finally revealed. And that was the forerunner, that was an early version of the kind of plan Hamas executed on October 7th. And in fact, Hezbollah had very detailed plans to do similar things to what was done on October 7th. So this isn't something new. And the other thing we also have to keep remembering is that as horrible and horrific as everything that happened on October 7th and since has been, Hezbollah's firepower, Hezbollah's abilities, and the reach of its missiles is infinitely larger and stronger than what we're seeing with Hamas.
Which means that the North will not be the primary victim, and therefore, again, the protracted nature of the response, how far down the North will be on the pecking order of who's being treated, is a serious question. But I'll tell you something positive that happened last week. We've been really working to try and help the displaced communities with medical supplies, with immediate care supplies, clothes. But as basic as that, to what we saw last week, which was a boot camp for the 17 and 18-year-olds that are doing their matriculation exams. And this, we partnered with a bunch of foundations, including the Rashi Foundation. And what we did was we brought together the teens that had these exams, and they hadn't seen their peers for 8 months. They'd been dispersed across the country, and they've come. It's finishing today. They spent the Shabbat together. They spent a week together learning for their exams, regrouping, hugging. There was a boy that said, "I haven't seen my best friend who's been in Eilat." That's a moment where we say, thank God for Canadian Jewish philanthropy, for Coast to Coast partnership, and for that kind of attentiveness to the real needs of the people right now.
What else is that money doing?
We also gave to the South, which was very important at the beginning. We gave to the Hostage Forum. That was very, very significant for us. In fact, all the Canadians were the first communities that gave to the Hostage Forum, because we believe this is the greatest humanitarian need, Jewish humanitarian need of our time. We also gave medical equipment and vehicles, psychological treatment and trauma care. Mashabim, which is the Resilience Center of the North, has turned out to be at the forefront of the national response to trauma in the country, and a model for helping communities within the hotels. As things change and with the unknown, we're actually also keeping funds so that we can shore up for when the time comes to really do something significant in the region and other significant assets that the region has, so that the day after there's going to be an incentive. Please, when there's security, as Metula says, there'll be incentives for strong communities to come back to the North.
Recently, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the region. He was talking about a war, second front, not maybe today, but soon. Metula, we're going to come back to you. As a resident of that area, what is the feeling that it's going to happen as a certainty, and not if, but when?
First, there is a war in the north. It's already happening. That's the situation. And what's going to happen? I don't know. I think that's one of the most difficulties in this time, the uncertainty, that we don't know what is going to happen and how it's going to continue or end. I hope that there will be a solution for that.
And what would that look like, a solution? What does that mean?
Of course, we don't want a situation will escalate and will be worse, but if that's what it takes to have the security in the region, it should be that, or an agreement that will keep Hezbollah away from the border. That's what should happen.
That's really, really important what Metula just said. At the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006, There was United Nations Resolution 1701, which called for Hezbollah to withdraw to north of the Litani River. And that would have given a buffer zone of no Hezbollah terrorists, no Hezbollah presence along the border. That never happened. That was never enacted. That was never, like many initiatives, it never took off. So that's one of the sort of rallying cries for people in the north is enforcing or having the equivalent of Resolution 1701 is the minimum, because to literally have, as Metula says, if you go to certain parts of Metula, you can see them across a valley where it's just like I'm looking at a park right now. That's going to be a huge part of what the goal of any kind of conflict, war will be.
I want to ask what is the, like UIA Canada and federations doing next? What's the next? You said you're hanging on to the money for now and you doing some smaller projects.
I would say we've done significant work so far with significant funds. Of the close to 140 million Canadian dollars, $55 million have been allocated. That actually shows smart philanthropy, to go fast when you need to and to go slow when you need to, bearing in mind the unknowns. And what we're looking to now is to begin to think together build together a coalition of the willing, to really think about what the day after looks like for the North, and see as a pan-Canadian community what we could do potentially together, possibly leveraging government dollars or other dollars so that we can really have a substantive impact for the day after.
Metula, did you want to have the last word?
I have to say that I do believe that we will go back and the northern region will thrive and be successful as it should be. And this crisis is also an opportunity, and there will be a day that people will come back and make it better.
Metula, were you born in the north?
I was born in the Western Galilee. I was born in Akko. 15 years ago, I came to study in Tel Chai College. I fell in love, of course, with the region, and I stayed. Found my husband there. I fell in love. My husband is a Canadian. He's a hockey coach in Metula. My husband is Michael Majeka. So now they can't practice. They practice in other places.
All the kids came here that came to
Exactly.
Winnipeg and Toronto. We did stories about all of them. I'm sure you know.
It was from our region, and I can tell you that it was very meaningful for them. They gave them the opportunity to practice. It gave them a break from what's going on here, and the feedback that we received from the parents was wonderful. They said that the first time they saw their kids coming back smiling after a very hard time here.
Thank you very much. We'll say only good news from now on. And
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. To learn more about the projects that Canadian Jewish federations are funding right now in Israel, go to the links in our show notes. Our show, the CJN Daily, is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. If you know anyone in northern Israel who's been displaced and is Canadian or has Canadian ties, and they would like to speak with us or write for us about what they're experiencing, have them get in touch at ebessner@thecjn.ca. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.